get you this way now.
Okay. I'm gonna,
Emily, when you use your speaker, hold it up to your mouth a little bit closer.
okay,
I had trouble hearing you last
Oh,
time.
I'm sorry. I'm just gonna leave this here.
Okay. Any money in there?
No. Are we?
We'll catch it at the end. Just follow the directions.
It doesn't work.
I'll just put my mask. Hey, Lynn.
So now what's the
May I have y'all's attention, please? It's 5 after 11. We want to go ahead and get started.
Okay.
I want to welcome you to the second Classics meeting of 2021-2022. We are so glad to have you here today on this beautiful October morning. I wanted to start off by honoring Charlie Waldrop. Many of you know that we lost a longtime member of the church and a longtime member of the Classics last week. He was 102 years old. He was a faithful member of the Classics, and he always helped with the Classics. He used to call, and I used to get phone calls from him, and he would say, "I'm calling to remind you of the upcoming Classics meeting." And so he was very helpful. In 2018, he was given a certificate for having perfect attendance at the Classics. And that was given by our chair, Shirley Allen. And so I figured he was about 98 years old at that time. Just remarkable. In July of this year, 3 or 4 months ago, several of us, along with Reverend John Calloway, went to see Charlie over at where he was living at Buckingham South. And we sang songs, we had refreshments, and it was just an amazing experience. It was just so affirming to spend time with him. And for probably most of us, it was the last time that we saw him. After that event, there were some photographs in the calendar, and I copied those photographs and sent those to Charlie's daughter, Lynn Smithberg. And a few days later, this was in early August, I got a phone call, and most of you remember how Charlie talks with his deep Southern accent. And he said, "Emily," he said, "this is John Calloway." And I said, "Charlie," I started laughing, and I said, "Charlie, you don't fool me." And I said, "I am so glad to hear your voice." So this was like in August, a few months ago, and he had his sense of humor at the age of 102 and going through a lot. So I was so moved by that. And what he really wanted when he called, he said, "I want to write y'all a thank you letter for coming to see me And he said, I need to know where to send it. He said, do you want me to send it to your home? And I said, I think just sending it to the church would be great, Charlie. And I was just blown away by the fact that he was a gentleman and he wanted to send this thank you letter. And I have this letter today. And I copied this in an email to many of you, but some of you have not seen this letter. It's dated August the 1st, 2021, and it's in Charlie's handwriting. Many thanks for having the July Classics meeting out here at Buckingham. I could see you all, and you could see me one more time. What a treat, 2 exclamation marks. I remember when we chose the name Classics, and we have lived up to this name. Glad that John could be with us. Love, Charlie Waldrop. I have kept this in my possession, but it probably needs maybe to go in the church history room or somewhere in the church. It is certainly not mine. It was addressed to the Classics. But I thought it was a beautiful letter. And I just want to say that I thank God for the friendship and love of this dear, gentle man. And I would ask for an amen.
Amen.
Without further ado, we were supposed to have had our speaker for today in the spring of 2020. And that did not happen. And so when we were planning this summer, everybody on the committee said, we want to have Chris come and talk about his cookbook. And so Chris is here today, and we are so pleased. Chris Hendricks is a professor of history at the Armstrong campus of Georgia Southern University in Savannah, where he has been teaching since 1993. He has worked extensively in archaeology, historic preservation, and museum interpretation with many organizations, including the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, Old Salem, Inc., and the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. He is the author of numerous publications, including The Backcountry, Towns of Colonial Virginia, and Old Southern Cookery. He received his Bachelor of Arts in History and English from Wake Forest University and his Master of Arts and Doctorate in History from the College of William and Mary in Virginia, where he specialized in early American history and material culture. And I have to admit, I took the bio that he emailed me, and I don't know what material culture is. Perhaps you can tell us. It is my pleasure to introduce Chris Hendricks, and I'd ask you to give him a hand.
Well, thank you, Emily, and thank you guys for asking me to come back. I was really kind of bummed when things started getting canceled in the spring, and it is just delightful. I haven't seen some of you for a year and a half. It's just very great. Well, material culture is what we're going to be talking about today. People using artifacts to study the past. Now, whenever we build anything, we embed that with certain qualities, things that we have learned, the way to put 2 pieces of wood together, how to swing the hammer, etc. And cooking would simply be another form of material culture because it reflects various societies, various ingredients that you would have at hand, etc. And you can learn about the people who have produced these things based on the items themselves. So I often ask my class, when we're talking about these kinds of things, do you know what the past tastes like? Well, if you buy my book, you will. John, is there a way we can bring down the lights or the screen a little bit? Well, when Mary Randolph published her cookbook, The Virginia Housewife, almost 2 centuries ago, she created an American classic. Although initially she had difficulty finding a publisher for the book when it first appeared in 1824, it became a bestseller. It sold so well that Randolph was working on the 3rd edition when she died 4 years later. And its acclaim grew well beyond a regional audience. The Virginia Housewife went through 19 editions before the Civil War, and the book has been in and out of print for almost 2 centuries. And there are several reasons for its longevity. It was the first regional American cookbook, the first published work on Southern cooking, and some food scholars credit it with being the first authentically American cookbook, period. The book is a fascinating historical document, and it provides insight into Southern culture, food traditions, household organization and management, and women's place in roles in society. Now, Mary Randolph was a member of one of the oldest and most distinguished families in Virginia. Her father, Thomas Mann Randolph, was orphaned at the age of 5, and he became the ward of surveyor and map maker Peter Jefferson, and was raised alongside his cousin Thomas. Thomas Mann Randolph married Anne Carey, and the couple had 13 children. Mary, who was known as Molly in the family, was their oldest. She and her siblings were educated by private tutors in reading, writing, and mathematics, and as a member of one of Virginia's elite families, Molly also learned and mastered the domestic skills necessary to run a large estate. She put all of those skills to use when, in 1780, at the age of 18, she married her cousin David Meade Randolph. Virginians were always marrying their cousins. Like many members of the family, David had political ambitions, and he asked his cousin, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, to assist him in furthering his political career. Now, although he had doubts about David's suitability, Jefferson approached the president with David's petition, and George Washington appointed him U.S. Marshal of Virginia. While David built his political career, Molly ran their domestic life, overseeing their plantation house and its dependencies, supervising 40 enslaved servants, and managing the household accounts. She and other women in her station had to acquire a wide array of skills to undertake such a formidable role successfully, including mastering intimate knowledge of food production, preparation, and presentation. This was necessary not only to feed a growing family. She gave birth to 8 children, 4 of whom made it to adulthood, but also to entertain visitors, including family, friends, politicians, and dignitaries. In the day-to-day operations of the plantation, enslaved cooks performed the actual cooking, but Molly supervised, instructing them in the recipes and closely inspecting their work. She later explained in the preface to her book, "If the mistress of the family will every morning examine minutely the different departments of her household, she must detect errors in their infant state when they can be corrected with ease." Hospitality was a hallmark of antebellum Virginia society, and it needed to appear effortless. Mary Randolph was a master. The family moved to Richmond in 1798. Moldavia, the Randolphs' new home, it would be the center part here. That was the original part of the house. It became a center of social life quickly as they entertained frequently and generously. By the way, this house later, its third owner took in a young ward, and he stayed there until he went to UVA. Guy you've never heard of, Edgar Allan Poe. Molly soon became acclaimed for serving excellent fare at these events and providing stimulating conversation. Now, while Moldavia was noted for social events, it also became a meeting place for political activities. At first, the political parties were beginning to form in the new republic, and David's leanings put him in the Federalist camp, in stark contrast with his cousin, Thomas Jefferson. And the two found themselves increasingly on opposite sides in political debates. We wouldn't know anything about that. It strained family ties, and even though Jefferson's daughter, Martha, had married Molly's younger brother, Thomas, in 1790. David served as U.S. Marshal through the Washington and Adams administrations, but that changed when Jefferson assumed office in 1801. The new president felt he had no choice but to remove his cousin from the federal job, although Jefferson was fully cognizant of the strain that it would bring to the family. The breach caused by David's dismissal grew rancorous, and David and Molly were not shy in placing blame. David's rhetoric became increasingly antagonistic as he criticized Jefferson's policies, and Molly was not afraid to join in the fray. Harmon Blennerhassett, an associate of Aaron Burr's, spent an evening in Molly's company in October of 1807, and Molly impressed him with her demeanor and acute penetration. And Blennerhassett was quite blunt, found that she was quite blunt in expressing her opinions, calling her very accomplished, of charming manners, and possessing a masculine mind. I think he was trying to be complimentary there. From this lady, the near relation of the president, and whose brother is married to his daughter, I have heard more pungent strictures upon Jefferson's head and heart, because they were better founded than any I have ever heard before. And she certainly uttered more treason than my wife ever dreamed of. Molly even helped spread reports about her cousin's relationship with Sally Hemings. The loss of David's job was a blow to the Randolphs financially, but their situation grew increasingly desperate with the collapse of tobacco prices and an economic recession. David was forced to sell their plantation, lots he owned in Richmond, and finally they had to part with Moldavia itself. The family moved into a rented home on Carey Street. By 1808, David had moved to Britain, where he spent the next 7 years studying coal mining operations in northern England and Wales, and trying to stir up interests in various inventions he had come up with among potential investors. When her husband went abroad, Molly took a bold step to support her family in their dire circumstances. In 1808, she placed an advertisement in the Richmond, Virginia Gazette and General Advertiser stating, "Mrs. Randolph has established a boarding house in Carey Street for the accommodation of ladies and gentlemen. She has comfortable chambers and a stable well supplied for a few horses." It would have been unusual for a woman of her station to support her family financially, but Molly felt that her friends would stand by her. She could select her customers carefully, and as there was a demand for excellent accommodations in Richmond, particularly when the General Assembly was in session, she could acquire a good clientele. Richmond society flocked to support her in the new venture. Now, she ran her boarding house in at least 2 different locations from 1807 until 1819, even after David got home from Britain. But as both were growing older, they decided to move to Washington, D.C., to the home of their son, William Beverly Randolph. And there they lived a relatively quiet life, although they enjoyed being in close proximity to their cousins, George Washington Parke Custis and Mary Ann Randolph Fitzhugh Custis, across the Potomac River at their home at Arlington. David continued to invent, and he spent time at Arlington developing a compound to waterproof the house. Apparently it leaked like a sieve. Meanwhile, Molly also worked on a project. She decided to publish her recipes. In writing her cookbook, Mary Randolph was following in a fine legacy of female authors dating back to the late 16th century. Unlike in France, where male chefs authored works predominantly for a male audience, in Britain, women wrote for women, although some of the earliest authors used male pseudonyms. In the first half of the 18th century, they began publishing under their own names, but they were discreet, using their initials, trade cards, or phrases such as "by a lady." After 1750, though, female authors began to take full credit for their work, and they used their reputations as cooks and housekeepers to help sell their books. But these were largely servants, unlike earlier authors who had been women of higher social standing. With the rise of the consumer revolution and the growth of literacy in Britain, increasing numbers of women from lower classes bought cookbooks. Some 425 new ones were published in Britain in the 18th century. Now, with reprints, this means an estimated 531,000 volumes being sold. Not surprisingly, British cookbook authors dominated the trade in the American colonies. The first cookbook printed in America appeared in Williamsburg, Virginia in 1742. It was an edition of Mrs. E. Smith's The Complete Housewife, or Accomplished Gentlewoman's Companion, which had first appeared in Britain in 1727. Well, the book sold well, and the publisher's successor reprinted it in 1752. But that was the only serious attempt to market an American-produced cookbook for 50 years. The first cookbook credited to an American author was also by a woman. Amelia Simmons published American Cookery in Hartford, Connecticut in 1796. She lifted many of the recipes directly from an English cookbook dating to 1772 called The Frugal Housewife. But she also included a dozen or so recipes that included indigenous American foods, including corn, cranberries, and turkey. Though Simmons' work lacked originality, she basically stole it. It was nonetheless quite popular, and a dozen reprints and pirated editions appeared before 1830. For 30 years after the publication of Amelia Simmons' book, no significant cookbook by an American author appeared until The Virginia Housewife. Collecting recipes and advice on household management was a common activity among members of Virginia's gentry. In the 18th century, women carefully recorded recipes that they collected, learned from others, or found in published works, binding the manuscript pages into book form. Mothers often organized and copied their collections into blank books to share with their daughters when they married or left to set up their own homes. And at least 2 manuscript collections of recipes passed through the Randolph family, one dating to around 1700 and another from 1743. In recording her recipes, Mary Randolph was following in a long and venerable tradition. She assembled her cookbook out of years of extensive personal experience. In the preface of the book, she explained, "The greater part of the following recipes have been written from memory, where they were impressed by long continued practice." She hoped her recipes would appeal to a wide audience, writing, "Should they prove serviceable to the young, inexperienced housekeeper, it will add greatly to that gratification which an extensive circulation of the work will like to confer." The book exceeded all of her expectations and sold to experienced cooks as well as young wives. When putting together her own personal recipe collection, Martha Jefferson Randolph carefully copied out more than 50 recipes from her sister-in-law's book, crediting Mary before passing the manuscript on to her daughter, Virginia Jefferson Randolph Trist, in classic Southern fashion. Randolph's cookbook was both modern and practical. She didn't include incredibly elaborate dishes that frequently appeared in English cookbooks that nobody would ever make. Similarly, she advised her readers not to overwhelm their guests with a vast array of dishes during a meal. Profusion is not elegance. A dinner justly calculated for the company and consisting for the greater part of small articles, correctly prepared and neatly served up, will make a much more pleasing appearance to the sight and give a far greater gratification to the appetite than a table loaded with food, and from the multiplicity of dishes unavoidably neglected in the preparation and served up cold. One thing of which Randolph did approve was using plenty of vegetables. More than 40 different variety of vegetables appear in her recipe. This reflected a major change that was occurring in American diets beginning around 1780 as vegetable consumption increased dramatically. Cooks began preparing individual vegetable dishes instead of just boiling things together in stews or other one-pot meals. The trend began among the wealthy, but quickly spread to members of all levels of society in the new United States. In her recipes, Randolph repeatedly stressed that vegetables be cooked sparingly to crispness, a far cry from the stewed vegetables which later became prevalent in Southern cooking. And despite admonitions for freshness, Randolph's work also reflected a second trend that was developing in the American diet at the end of the 18th century, using preserved foods, meats, vegetables, ciders, etc., instead of relying only on ingredients that were available during certain seasons of the year. Widely acknowledged as the first collection of Southern recipes, the Virginia Housewife reflects a cuisine that, with a wide range of cultural influences, variety, and sophistication. Unsurprisingly, it is based primarily on English cooking traditions, but even so, by including 17 different herbs and additional seasonings in her recipes, Randolph altered British dishes to suit Southern taste, adding a few cloves of garlic in her Scotch collops, for example, reveals that the Southern palate preferred more intense flavors than its British or Northern counterparts. Native American foods can be found among the recipes through the use of American vegetables and grains such as pumpkin and corn, as well as techniques for barbecuing meats, particularly shote or young pig. African and Caribbean traditions contributed by enslaved black women appeared in the pages through foods such as yams, sorghum, and bananas, as well as dishes like gumbo. The presence of French Huguenots in 17th century Virginia and refugees from the French Revolution, plus the influence of Randolph's cousin, Francophile Thomas Jefferson, meant that French fare was present as well, represented by breads, fondues, fritters, French fries, what she calls to fry sliced potatoes, and no fewer than 22 flavors of ice cream. Spanish dishes such as ropa vieja and gazpacho appear either because of the close proximity to Spanish America or through the agency of Randolph's sister, Harriet Randolph Hackley, who spent several years in Cadiz, Spain. The Virginia Housewife includes recipes for Italian polenta. Mary Randolph even introduced Americans to macaroni and cheese. Possibly the most surprising foreign influence in the book is South Asian. Randolph includes a recipe for curry powder. The subtitle to Randolph's cookbook, "Method is the Soul of Management," strikes a theme that runs throughout the work. Randolph does not just mean method in food production, although that may be part of her intent, but she also had a larger vision in mind. In her preface, she wrote, "The grand arcanum of management lies in 3 simple rules. Let everything be done at the proper time, keep everything in its proper place, and put everything to its proper use." Randolph's rules emphasize organization and economy of movement, foreshadowing the work of social reformer Catherine Beecher and following the French cooking system mise en place. The 1825 edition included amendments and additional recipes and 3 illustrations of new inventions: a hot water heater for baths and a refrigerator or icebox that would have been extremely useful with her ice cream recipes. Her basic design was still in use until the development of electric refrigerators. With his inventive mind, David may have assisted in the development of the inventions and the production of the illustrations. As I mentioned before, Randolph was working on the 3rd edition of the Virginia Housewife when she died January 23rd, 1828, at the young age of 65. At her request, her body was interred at Arlington in a spot marked out by herself. Her grave is the first one on the estate that later became the site of Arlington National Cemetery. Mary Randolph's work lived on after her death. Through its numerous editions, it taught Southern cuisine to thousands of cooks across the United States and became the standard of cooking for generations. Mary Randolph succeeded in producing the most significant American cookbook of the 19th century. Thank you. I am happy to take any questions that you guys might have. Thelma? Well, this book is the result of a present. My father was also a history professor, and whenever Daddy traveled, he always brought Mother back a gift. Well, usually it was a piece of jewelry. And one trip to Philadelphia, he walked into a bookstore next door to the hotel where he was staying and found an 1860 edition of the Virginia Housewife. And my mother collected cookbooks. So Daddy brought this back to her, and she had a blast. She spent the next year or so reading through the cookbook and converting the recipes to modern measurements, designating oven temperatures, things like that. By the way, that's not me, that's my older brother Jim. Chris, age 9, took the photo. Daddy said that Mother had to publish this. And they lined up a publisher for it, but unfortunately the guy went bankrupt, and the manuscript on onion skin ended up in a metal file box. Well, about 7 years ago, my parents moved, and during the move, I found the manuscript. I happened to be going on leave to do work on a different project, and so I took it, did the research on Randolph, the Virginia Housewife, the various cooking traditions, wrote it up, and gave it to my mother as a Christmas present. Best Christmas present ever. Now, I'm a tenured professor. I'm a full professor. I really didn't need another publication. So what we talked about doing was finding some agency that could benefit from the sale of the cookbook. I had a bit of experience with 18th century cooking myself because in high school I worked at the museum, Old Salem, and did some cooking there. So worked through my mom's recipes to make them as close to the original as possible, and we began looking for various possible places. I happened to be at an event at the Davenport House one day, and I asked the director, Jamie Cradle, what kind of things they were working on, and as you may know, they are building an addition onto the Kennedy Pharmacy to convert that into their reception center so that they can restore the ground level of the museum. And she said, well, we're looking for various fundraising events. And I asked her, would you like a cookbook? They hired and she was just really excited about this because she had actually gone to a Virginia Housewife symposium, because this book historically is used in antebellum museums all around the country, including the Davenport House. So she thought this was great. They hired Janice Shea, who was a local book representative, and she shopped it around. The University of Florida, University of Georgia were interested, but she located a popular press out of Connecticut that actually gave an advance. Historians do not get advances on their books unless you're Doris Kearns Goodwin or somebody like that. We were amazed. We took the money from the advance and hired 2 professional food photographers. This is Jason James. He's a local photographer. And we shot a couple of dishes. One of the crazy things about this project, Jamie asked me, would you like to use some of the Davenport collection of early 19th century porcelain for the photos? So you are seeing early 19th century recipes in early 19th century pottery. The photos were incredible and were shipped up to Connecticut. They loved them. They said, we need to have more. So they hired a second photographer, a woman named Deborah Llewellyn, who is nationally known. She's based in Atlanta, and she shoots photos for all of the leading culinary magazines. She came down, and it was hysterical. We spent a weekend. I was in the kitchen making one dish ahead while they were set up in the living room shooting the photographs from the book. Brian was doing art direction. And it was amazing. This was one of my favorite things. One of the pieces of porcelain that we talked about using was in a pattern that was made by the Davenport Company. I believe it's based in Sheffield, England. But the soup tureen turned out to be too large. So Brian suggested using a still life, making a still life with it, and that became the dedication page. The Davenport Company was no relation to the Davenport family, but we just thought it was too great of a connection to pass up. All of the proceeds from the sale of the book are going to support the Davenport House. That was a very long-winded answer to your question. The serendipity in putting all of this together was just incredible. It has been a project unlike any I have ever done before, and has been a lot of fun.
Two questions, and I'm not sure it's appropriate to ask the first one at this juncture, but could you give us a progress report on the funds that have accrued for the Davenport?
Unfortunately, I don't know. Yes, she was asking if we know what kind of funds have been raised up to this point. And I don't know what the answer is. I know they printed, and this is also crazy, my first book, which was out of an academic press, they printed 300 copies. And we're just so amazed when those were sold that now you can get it in paperback. They published 5,000, and they have been sold on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, Books A Million. All of the major book outlets have been selling these things. I was in Washington State over the summer, and we walked through a bookstore, nerd academic thing to do, and there was my book. In Bellingham, Washington, of all places. So I can't wait to find out how much.
That's great. The other question I have, I was fascinated by the various influences, including Southeast Asia, or notably Southeast Asia. But how about the African influence? The women who cook through agriculture, etc.
Right. The question was, what were the African influences? And these are coming in through, of course, the enslaved cooks who she was working with. You see it, as I mentioned in the presentation, in various food items like okra, dishes like gumbo. Sorghum appears as a sweetener in a couple of her dishes, and things like that. So it is a very distinct presence. As for the South Asian influence, I haven't a clue where she got it. India is becoming increasingly British, in the late 18th century, and with her traveling in higher circles, particularly in the diplomatic corps, she probably was introduced to it that way, but I would love to be able to find out more about that particular connection. Speaking of diplomatic circles, when the second edition came out, she sent a copy to President Madison and said, I hope you enjoy this. And he wrote back, well, I won't be able to do it you justice, but I'll let you know what my wife thinks. The question was, what about cakes and cookies? And the answer is yes. One of the oldest cookie recipes, in fact, arguably the oldest cookie in the world, has a version of the recipe in this. It's called a jumble. And it's, as Mary Randolph produced it, it's a simple spice cookie. A lot of her cakes none of her cakes use any kind of leavening other than yeast. Those Baking soda was just a little bit later. So hers are more kind of air rising recipes. So you have to keep those ovens closed, things like that. Of the various cakes, and there are lots of pies as well. Some of my favorites, there is a citrus apple pie that has sliced oranges and lemons, which you boil and add sugar. So you're using the rind. You have to get it really thin. It is just to die for. It's an incredibly elegant pie. Just delicious. Any other questions? The question was, how did Mother translate it? And it was through trial and error, basically. Because Randolph would have she would just assume that people had a certain basis in cooking knowledge. So she would have statements like, when the fire be ready. And things like that. Other things when are simple, when Mary Randolph says you need to use a gill of wine. Well, we don't use gills, but you can look it up and figure that out. So there are things like that. But some of it was just trial and error. And occasionally there were some real errors. One is I remember, and this was as a child, because when she was first doing this, I was like 9 or 10. And there's a recipe for what Mary Randolph calls pumpkin squash. And my mother assumed she meant like a jack-o'-lantern type pumpkin, and what you do is you carve out the pumpkin and you mix up the things and then you bake it in the pumpkin shell. Well, this miserable thing that came out. I found out that actually pumpkin squash in Virginia is something completely different. I can't remember the name of it. Simlins, which is a type of squash, which they called pumpkin squash. So there was a little mistranslating going on, but and what was weird was when my mom was doing this, it was just what we had for dinner. We didn't know where it was coming from or various things other than like, Mom, I don't think you should be baking jack-o'-lanterns. Yeah. Well, I'd like to thank you again very much for having me come and speak to you today. I do have some copies of the book if anyone is interested. And again, all of the proceeds from the sale will be going to support the Davenport House and the mission of the Historic Savannah Foundation. Thank you guys again.
Thank you so much, Chris.
I think some of us in this church have heard Chris speak about his parents in various ways in the past that really make us appreciate what a wonderful family project this is. Your father's buying the cookbook, your mother's work, which we saw, thanks to the handy photographer she had at her disposal at a young age, and then your work. And I remember once when Chris spoke on a Wednesday night and talked about some experiences in his life, and he talked about your parents and your gratitude for the kind of parents you had and your appreciation of the fact that they taught you how important it was to express condolences to people who were grieving. And that stood out in my memory because it was a wonderful picture of your family's thoughtfulness and your love and appreciation of your parents. And so I think one of the contexts in which those of us who know you see this work is what a lovely family project it is. And that's a marvelous thing. And then, of course, your gift to Savannah to the Davenport House, yours and your mother's gift with the book, we all can be grateful for. Thank you so much. Some of you may know, several years ago, there was a wonderful new book published on Savannah Squares, and I don't remember the title. Was it called Savannah Squares? Savannah Square by Square. Thelma Brown and I were going to learn the squares, square by square. Years ago, we started out. I don't mean just their names, but to really learn about their history. I think we got to 2 or 3 squares. Our project didn't go too much further. But it's a wonderful book, and if you haven't seen it, it's a great book to have. It's also a lovely book to give people. But part of the dedication of that book is to Chris Hendricks. It's to Professor Chris Hendricks, because one of the authors of that book, there were 2, and one of them had been your student as a master's in the master's program in public history. Is that right? And so when I read the book, I didn't know that, and I opened the book, and there was this wonderful dedication, and it was yet another of those times, and I know what many of you know what I'm talking about, when I thought, I am so fortunate to know Chris Hendricks. So we are so fortunate to have you come this morning, and we thank you so very much. Are there any announcements that any of you need to make? One announcement that Emily left me with before she went over to meet our caterer and to secure lunch is about the kitty. And some of you know we have a kitty. We put money in there, and there is a box in the narthex when you go out the door. Hang an immediate left, and there was a box there, I think, that Abby left for the kitty. So we have money, but what we've decided to do, rather than keeping it in a container and keeping cash and trotting that out at every meeting, there it is. Katie's got it. And she's going to put, excuse me, you don't need to turn to the left. As you go straight out through the front door, it'll be to your right. We've kept that kitty going, and we do some good things with that, and we can talk later and at another time about what maybe some ideas this year. But if you would like to deposit anything in the kitty, it will be on the table just as you go out the door. Lunch. Those of you who were here last time, we're going to sort of repeat that drill for anybody who didn't hear those instructions. Lunches from our caterer, Susanna, and they're based on recipes in the book. This lunch today her dishes are for your lunch, and that will be available to you in a box. We'll ask that you walk into the McDonough Street side of the building, go down the sidewalk, walk into the McDonough side of the educational building, walk through the hallway to the Hull Street side, and when you get there, you'll be handed your box in a bag, make it a little bit easier to carry it across the street. And if anybody hasn't paid, you can pay at that time if you've reserved a lunch. If you have not reserved a lunch and you would like one, is there anybody who didn't get on the list but you'd like a lunch? Okay. Well, I think we're in good shape then. And once again, thank you so much, Chris. And let's close with a word of thanks for the lunch we're about to receive. God, thank you for your great gifts to us, for the gift of friendship, for the gift of family love, for the gift of this church and what our friends and our neighbors and our fellow church members mean to us. And we ask that you would bless the food that we are about to receive so that we might be nourished and that we might in turn help to nourish others. And we remember those today who do not have enough to eat. And we pray that our church and all of us as individuals may make a contribution to the world and to our neighborhoods and to our city so that others will have enough to eat. In your name, amen. Thank you so much.